So now we have a panel with our partners. We started yesterday. We started our summit with Dr. Bernice A. King and two of our partners for this summit. And we're going to close out the summit with the same folks. So we're going to have Dr. Bernice A. King come on now, CEO of the King Center, leader, speaker extraordinaire. Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing wonderful.
Doing wonderful. Great, great, great. You've been listening in. I know we've been talking and you've been in the background and then watching. What are your thoughts about what you've heard so far?
Well, I think the thing that's been most important throughout all of these different panels is, the importance of this mindset that we've been trying to stress. Whether we're talking about the environment, the issue around racism, um, and then of course, today, what culminated in what I hope people understand is that this whole mindset has to be, and I mentioned this yesterday, I believe has to be developed out of the nonviolent philosophy and methodology of Martin Luther King Jr. Sure, there are other things we can, add to the equation that are consistent with that. But I think it's the most fundamental part of all of this. And of course, it's part of who I am. It's the legacy that I am perpetuating. And more importantly, I think it is one of the best ways to get to a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. So, I want to, to say I just appreciate everybody who made these contributions and look forward to some more.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're going to bring on Dr. King, Jill Savitt, who's the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, friend of the King Center, friend of ours. Jill moderated a great panel this morning. Thank you so much, Jill, for partnership and also moderating and being a part of panels each year for the summit.
My pleasure.
Welcome.
I am
thank you.
Inspired by these conversations. I think it's been fantastic, and people are going to be able to put into action these recommendations immediately, which I think is a real blessing.
Thank you, Jill. And then we have rounding out our panel for this panel. It's Karen Ryan. I jokingly always add her middle name, Karen Diane Ryan, who is a senior human rights advisor at the Carter Center here in Atlanta. Karen, welcome. You were on a great panel today too. You're muted. So
yeah, my dogs were barking in the background, so I thought I'd spare you that extra noise. Yeah, I mean, what a wonderful 2 days. And of course, I always have to thank you guys and Dr. King, especially with your leadership. Everybody always starts every panel by saying, isn't this wonderful that we have this opportunity once a year to go deep, right? So every one of the panels went really deep, and it'll be fun talking through. I would just want to urge the audience, if you didn't check out the panels, go to the YouTube channel, King Center YouTube channel, and watch the panels. Like, pick one a day if you don't have time to sit and watch them all. But go back and watch them, because there's so much richness there. And, maybe one thing that y'all could do is just do the little action items, put it in one place. People could check off, like, oh yeah, somebody told me to go and do this Nonviolence 365 training. It's online. Let me go check that out. Like a to-do list. It was fabulous. So thank you. And I look forward to jumping in with all of us ladies and getting into the discussion.
I think what you just raised, Karen, is the first thing we want to talk about. How do we make it so this isn't just a yearly thing? How can we continue to, as Dr. King was sharing with me earlier today, have these summit follow-up sessions before the next summit, our three organizations planning and thinking about how we continue the conversation on the climate crisis, on racism, on how media influences mindset, all of these topics we talked about in this summit. How do we keep it going? Jill, what are your thoughts about that, Dr. King, Karen? How do we keep it going?
Well, I think you all have mastered the format on this. And as much as I hope people can meet in person. I think Zoom still allows so many people to come together, but there is opportunity also for people to self-organize and discuss what's going on in their own communities. I know people tune into the Global Summit it literally is global, from around the world. And I think one of the most important things is as the mindset transforms, is to spread that to many more people. And so the people who tune in can immediately put into practice being force multipliers of this message, because they can take Nonviolence 365, they can watch the panels that happened before, and they can set up their own group. So maybe that's something the three of our organizations can help birth, is giving themes and ideas on a regular basis that people can also take into their communities, so we can extend this even further.
Thank you.
And also, just adding to what she's saying, I do think it's important that we try to look at each one of these panels and see how we can further expound on them and maybe bring some real work to life related to them. You know, oftentimes when we have convening summits, conferences, etc., so much is shared and people are like, okay, we want a little bit more, but the time doesn't permit it. So the idea is for the rest of this year, setting aside some time to just kind of say, okay, let's do something else to delve into unlearning. You know, let's do something else to delve into. Dr. West, we were talking earlier, and all of us are very aware of the threats that are happening in our world, especially related to the environment. Tornadoes yesterday, what's happening in California, you know, with so many things. And maybe we need to have a deeper dive into some of this so that, you know, one of the things you mentioned, Karen, during that session is how my father was able to rally people around one thing. We don't do that anymore because everybody feels like we got to tackle it all. And, you know, there are a lot of egos. And certainly we understand the need for everybody to kind of have their identity. But at the end of the day, in the name of, you know, saving our planet and saving each other from self-destruction and each other destruction, we may have to say, hey, okay, while we are doing our little separate works, what is that one place we join? Because it reminds me of Nehemiah when he said, you know, the work is extensive and we're widely separated on the wall. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, come to this place, come hither, and our God will fight for us. And I just think there's something that we collectively, cooperatively, coordinated in a coordinated manner need to do so that that greater divine force can add its power to what we've been doing every day. So
yes. Oh, that's so great. You know, one of the things over the last 2 days that I came away with was this idea that we have to think first, starting with me, right? And that beloved community mindset. In the previous panel, just before this, Fly talked about going through a divorce and then ending up friends with her ex-husband and being a good co-parent. It's like that took her, she went through the Nonviolence 365 training and was able to implement those principles into her personal life. I was like, hello, that is the point, is that personal transformation must come first. Okay,
yes.
So we do that, but then we have to think about short-term, if we're in this work, we have the short-term needs of people like Shane Claiborne and Reverend Liz Theoharis yesterday was talking about Poor People's Campaign and the real needs, that immediate needs that people have. But we tend to sort of split off and say, we're the humanitarian group over here, so we're going to meet the immediate needs. And then some other people will think about that upstream, long-term. You know, we need to figure out how to do both, and you know, short-term and long-term. And maybe one thing that came out of all this rudeness in public discourse, because it's so rude to go on Twitter, you know, people have just lost all decorum.
Dignity, decorum, yes.
So, yeah. But one advantage of that is that people are willing to be more frank. Have you noticed that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can be in conversations and be like, yeah, I'm only human. You know, we'll be in a coalition meeting and somebody acts out with ego and everything. And you can, you know, you might have previously just walked away and said, you know, I can't deal with that group. That's ego. I can't deal with that ego. But now it's almost like we've made some emotional calluses where we can be like, you know what? That's some nonsense you just said. Let's sit down and work it out, right? Because I do think what you're saying, Dr. King, is so important. We really have to think about, you know, on the climate panel we were talking about, is like, this is the existence of humanity on the planet we're talking about, you know?
Yes.
So like the climate movement needs to get together and focus on something. Okay, maybe it's the funding mechanism that they agreed to, but there's no money in it. In COP27, you know, there's this big funding mechanism for a just transition that was established, but no money is in it. So maybe everybody needs to get together and yell and scream and kind of go in their legislatures and use everything in our power to push for that money to be put there. You know, right here in Atlanta, we talked the other day about the housing crisis. You know, maybe there's something we need to do to get together and really push. And, you know, you said this yesterday, or was it yesterday or last week, Dr. King, you said this hard work. That's a lot of work.
Hard work.
And so, but if we get everybody pushing in the same direction, maybe it's not going to be so hard, you know. Many hands make light work. You know, so anyway, I'm sorry, I'll stop talking now because we got so much to cover.
But that's important, Karen, that many people pushing in the same direction, and the education piece that we're all talking about, because when I hear climate crisis, I hear racism, I hear poverty, I hear militarism, I hear all of our unsheltered neighbors, how the climate crisis affects them, how it affects housing, how it affects community, all those things. If we don't solve the climate crisis, then it contributes to disparities that already exist. And I think one of the things that this summit is able to do, and the follow-up conversations will do, is say, here's this topic, let's educate on it.
Yeah.
And then here's some things we can do in terms of action. I believe you're right, Dr. King, that if we take each panel and put some action steps with it and some education with it and have another discussion on it and then another, then we're able to build out.
And that's what I was going to say, because there's so many of us, concluding myself, that are not as educated around the environmental issues. Many of us are leading institutions. And so what is the solution to getting up to speed some of the leaders across this country that are not in the climate space on an everyday basis, so that they can begin to disseminate information to their constituents? And what is the way to get it disseminated through the faith community, where the largest gathering of people takes place during the weekend, every weekend. And so, because every time I hear the discussion around the environment, I'm saying, but the problem is there's so many ignorant people, and no matter what we need to do, and the urgency with which we're saying it, if I, as an individual, have no clue of what you're saying, I need the dots connected. How does this? Yeah, I see the floods here, I see the storms here, I see the disaster there, but I'm not translating it into what I every day need to shift and do. And there's always a disconnect in our world, it seems, between what we know to be the right thing to do or the necessary things and people getting the necessary information so that they can be a part of that. There's always this little small group of people who typically tend to be more interested, active, and all that. But this overwhelming majority of people don't know what happened. There's a saying that there's three types of people in the world: the few who make things happen, and then they're the many who just kind of watch things happen. But then they're the majority, the overwhelming amount of people who just don't know what happened, and that's the problem. Yeah. They see the stuff, but it's like, okay, how does that involve me? What do I need to do? So we've got to figure this out so that we're not continuing to the same, audiences, so to speak.
I think that's right. The connections among our institutions can reach out to the people who are making a difference, to those few who are working on it, and let us know. And by curating a conversation among our three institutions for the public, really set an agenda and put out a rally cry to people. And I think people want to be engaged. I think it's just very hard for them to figure out where they plug in and what in their daily life. So often NGOs and other organizations ask people for money, but we also need people's time, and we need them to change their mindset. Both of those things are true, and that's something everyone can participate in. If we serve up things that are meaningful and that help them engage and help them reach out to other people, this idea of force multipliers is real. If everyone who participated in this summit reached out to more people and brought them in, we'd be doing an incredible service on issues that we care about. And I do think it's a great idea to go deep on particular issues that are across our agenda.
Can I also add something that it's been on my heart? We are being actively divided. There are people who are intent on it distracting us from the solutions, right? I don't hate to mention names because I don't want to give fame to people who I don't really want to lift up, but there are forces that talk about chaos. Chaos or community, interesting, that talk about chaos as a method of keeping the sort of the liberals or whatever distracted from from really what's going on, the corporate interests, etc., the military, and your father, Dr. King, knew this, and at the end of his life, he looked around, he spoke up about some really difficult topics, right? And even his friends said, no, don't go there. Don't go there. That's not, don't talk about the Vietnam War. Don't talk about U.S. militarism. That's the other thing that we need to put front and center for people to read the Vietnam speech of 1967 at Riverside Church, because that is such an important diagnosis he made at that time, 55 years ago. Was it? Yeah, 55 years ago. That and how he came to this idea of the triple evils, how they're connected. There are forces, and I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist. It's just true that there are forces trying to keep people distracted from where the power is and how it's being generated towards fossil fuels, towards the military industrial complex, all these things, and to corporate power, away from the interests of average people. So when we do these conversations, because I do think we should do this and continue these conversations, we have to realize we have to break through the noise of that. In order to reach people, we actually have to break through a wall, a great wall of noise, of people trying to say, no, look over here, over here, over here. Look at all this thing that you should be divided over. So we have to figure out how to break through that noise. And that takes some strategizing, takes organizing, it takes getting bigger voices. Well, you're Dr. King, you've got one of the biggest voices around, so that's a huge advantage. And our three institutions, as Jill suggests, coming together is so important. We need to get, it's just a critical mass that we need to break through that noise and to give, because I think Jill's right. People want to be engaged. They want hope. They actually want to feel like what they're putting their energy in is making a difference. And, so these conversations are the ones that we need. So it's a great opportunity.
Yeah. As we, talk about the need to work together, I'm wondering, how do we make interconnectedness tangible? There are words that Dr. King used that people think are just spiritual, lofty ideas. Interconnectedness, interrelatedness, interdependent, how do we make that tangible for people? Because I think sometimes when we hear it, we're not thinking, no, we are literally interdependent, interrelated, interconnected. I think if we can build that too, along with the other things we're talking about, we'd be able to get people to see if we don't address these issues, It's not to the detriment of Black people if racism isn't eradicated. It's to the detriment of all of us. And it doesn't just affect this group. If climate change continues, it's going to hurt all of us. If we don't eradicate poverty, it affects all of us. And showing not just the spiritual ways that happens, but the tangible ways. I think it's that education again. What spaces? I know we have social media. When we think about making interdependence tangible, what does that mean? What type of conversations do you have to have? Because it can seem like something that's far away from people. How do we bring it closer?
Well, I think the videos that are a part of this event are just fantastic. And we have to recognize that that's how a lot of people are getting their information now, in these bite-sized video chunks. And that might be something else that our organizations can collaborate on, is the creation of very powerful, it works. Corporations sell their goods this way because it works. And there's an opportunity for us to put together resources and creativity and to set an agenda about communicating about these issues in very powerful ways, but that are shorter, that are bite-sized, even though it's very hard for us to do because there's so much we want to cram in, but recognizing that we have to put some bait out there to grab people. Juanetta, you're 100% right. What people don't realize is that the apathy and going along is to our own detriment. Right now it's happening to certain vulnerable groups and people don't feel like it's going to impact them. But, COVID should have taught us this. It would have been for everyone to see that our health is interconnected, that if one person is sick, how it literally is contagious. And these other issues have a contagion too, of discrimination, of hate, of looking down on people, of making people feel like they are disposable. Inevitably, it cheapens all of us.
So I'm just going to repeat what Jill said. That's a key word, repeat. What she's saying is we need to repeat in the visual world and, the imagery of what interconnected looks like. So by collectively working with our media teams and saying, okay, we're going to launch a campaign with these different messages that we're trying to embed in people's head. This is not going to change through one conference, through even one Beloved Community Talk, through one conference or session that you all have at the Carter Center or the Center for Civil and Human Rights. But we know the power, as you just said, of marketing and idea. So let's market interconnectedness and interdependence, Let's market other centeredness. Let's get the best minds that we have attached to us and create these multimedia presentations that we can just put out, because repetition, it grabs people and subconsciously, if nothing else. And eventually they start doing things kind of consistent with what was in those marketing messages. So I would be excited to do something like that because I love to see people transform, and they're not even consciously aware, but eventually they recognize, I'm a little bit different. I'm taken to something. This thing is getting my attention. But if we don't do it enough, that one time it's not enough.
That's right. And I've said this before, I think at the summit. I just love this, I think it was John Lennon who said, if we sold peace the way we sell soap, we would have peace.
Yes.
Because those companies, they know how to tell people why you need soap and why their soap is better, So, I think that it is crucial. And I think, but people want to feel part of something. It's like you've got to link it with some action. So there's as we were talking about, there's this, it begins with me part, which is the reflection we've been talking about for the last few days, this mindset. And one of the things that we did at the Carter Center, which I'd love to continue, is we did a book study for Carter Center staff on the book Caste, Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, just to go deep. And the relationships that came out of that were really, and the personal conversations that happened, and the kind of the opening up of the heart and the mind. Now, this is something different than what we're talking about right now, which is bits of messaging. But I would say, in addition to that, which we obviously need, is opportunities for people to connect with each other on these deep conversations. I think book groups, you know, Oprah Winfrey used to do her book groups, right? You know, and it's a great way for people to have permission to connect with a topic at a deep level. Mm-hmm. So that's just another suggestion of going deep and personal. And on the messaging, we have to connect it with some action. I think that people want to feel connected to something changing, right? Yes. So, you know, you can get really mobilized around something like on climate. It would be, you know, something very specific like this funding mechanism, or next COP. You know, the next COP is next December. There's some action item people can really rally around. I think we should also work together here in our own city around some of the issues that are, because it's very important to anchor yourself in local challenges, because it gives you it really challenges you to go beyond your comfort zone and say, okay, here's the issue. Let's put our heads together until we find a way forward. And, you know, we've talked about the housing crisis, or the truth telling work that's so necessary. We've talked in previous years about how we're never going to heal our country if we don't tell the truth about our history. You know, we should do something together on really telling the truth of our nation, slavery, and until now, the systemic racism. You know, so there are things that we need to do together to heal our communities, right? That is going to help us be more effective also on some of these global challenges, I think.
Yeah, and I'll add, we had a very interesting conversation about the focus on self, what it has done to us, this focus on I, me, mine. If, you know, I have to win, you have to lose. That was a panel earlier today. And what we ended up talking about, we got pretty real about how Karen said before that there are forces out there that are trying to divide us. And it's not just, it has an impact on institutions having trouble working together. The pie feels very small. There's competition for donors, for media, there's ego. There's all kinds of reasons that organizations have trouble working together. And in part it's human nature, and in part it's deliberate in the environment that we're working in. People want us not to work together. But I think our organizations doing that, it starts with us. It starts with me individually, and then it starts with us organizationally. That organizations are kind of like people. And I think it's a very powerful thing for our three organizations to come together and work together and show that it's difficult sometimes and you work through it, but it's possible. And I think that will encourage other groups to come together in new ways, because it is tough out there. The problems are so vast. And there are all kinds of things that keep our organizations, not our three, but organizations in general, from allying in a really deep way.
Yeah. Dr. King called it a Nelson task. Whenever I read that, I think about that word. I said, whoo, for something that should be Nelson but necessary.
Yes.
That's the way I think about it. He says it's a Nelson task, but we have to do it. We have to organize our strength into compelling power. This summit is highlighting for people that the panel you led this morning, Jill, for example, highlighting for people things that we might not talk about as often, like the quest for power, because it may not be often that people think about how a quest for power, unhealthy power, because Dr. King said if you pair power with love, he talked about how it's a great force and it can be used for great things, you know. But only when it's without love that it becomes reckless and abusive. So power in and of itself isn't bad, that type of conversation, it may sound like, okay, we don't need to talk about that. But when you really get into power dynamics and what's happening in the world, I think about the value of what we've talked about in these last 2 days, how these are necessary conversations, even the unlearning. To your point, Dr. King, what would happen if we continually put before people, this is a question for all of us, the things we need to unlearn? What shifts would we see in society if we talked about continually, even in visually, what we need to unlearn in order to learn to live together?
That sounds intriguing. You know, I think it has to be mapped out, though, you know, the unlearning to learn. You know, I think that has to be really mapped out because, as we said yesterday, when you kind of empty yourself of one thing, you need to fill it up with something else, because otherwise something like the unlearning will seep in. So even doing some imagery stuff around that, it seems very intriguing, because it's, again, you know, it's not to sound like a broken record, but intentionality, consistency is essential to all of what we're talking about. And until that happens, we'll be having this conversation in 2024. Yeah. So I'm just hoping that, you know, we will be able to start the effort to set perhaps a standard that other people can follow, especially, you know, coming from the city that we are located in. I think it would be very powerful. But yeah, that's another one of those things, because, you know, I keep looking at the things we're doing and I keep asking the question, what's missing? What's lacking? Why does it seem like we're going through these cycles, or we're making these, like, you know, small changes and adjustments, but and maybe I'm exaggerating the quote unquote transformation that happened from the movement, but it just seemed like, and of course it was 12 and a half years of time period from 55 at least to 68 that my father was a part of the leadership. But it just seems like, you know, they really shifted some major stuff, you know, foundationally. And the only thing I can say is we have a lot to learn from what they did, how they did it in particular. Instead of feeling like, okay, that was then, this is now. But no,
you know,
yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, when your father at the end of his life, you know, came to this realization that this was a human rights struggle, more than a civil rights struggle, that the Poor People's Campaign came, it was quite radical, where he saw those connections. Now think about, this is 55 years ago, and what has happened. I have a friend who's an economist who shows a graph of the wealth disparity from World War II until the early 80s. Think about what happened politically in the early 80s in this country. There was a sort of shared growth, shared economic wealth. It was kind of parallel. You had the very wealthy and you had the average kind of rising along a similar trajectory. In 1981, 82, remember what was happening at that time? That graph goes like this, where the wealthy go like this and the middle class and the poor go flat and down. So what he warned us about in 1967, 68 has come to pass.
Oh, yeah.
Is that the wealth gap has, you know, and this was, you know, where he said, you know, any nation that spends more on military expenditures than on social uplift is approaching spiritual doom. We are living that consequence. We have, you know, you don't have to completely abandon free enterprise system, but when you look at the excesses of extreme capitalism, which is what we're living with. I think this is the upstream problem, is that we have the military industrial complex that gobbles more and more. Why did our military budget go up by 45 billion this year after we withdrew from Afghanistan? It's because there is a machine in place that has to gobble up more and more and more all the time. So you have that, and then you have this extreme capitalism where corporations have all this power. So, you know, that is, to me, I look at that and I say, that's why we are stagnant, because our priorities are wrong. We have a homeless situation in this country. I'm from Southern California. You have whole rows of roads and communities that are just tent cities. Here in the city of Atlanta, we talked about the other day, you know, how is it possible that in the richest country in the history of the world, that we have people who do not have a place to lay their head, use the bathroom, and prepare their food and take care of their children? It is a moral crime, you know. And so I think that this is kind of, I feel like we're the frog in the water. You know, you start to heat the water and the frog doesn't realize it's cooked. I think 55 years ago, your father told us what it was: triple evils, poverty, racism, because we know where the vast impact is, and militarism. These go together.
Right.
So we have to kind of first realize that, and then be like, okay, how are we going to tackle these things in a way that is doable, builds community, makes us feel active and not hopeless?
I mean, I think it would be incredibly powerful to pick a goal and a target, and then to bring in the experts who can tell us how best to go about it. That we want to increase low-income housing, or we want to make sure that everyone in this city has shelter. Who has the power to make those decisions? Who influences those people? Because I think among our three organizations, we can get to all of them. And then to pick up the phone or show up outside someone's office every day until it's done, you know, that we have to make it untenable for people not to agree with what we suggest. And I think
untenable.
Untenable. Make it
creative tension.
Yes. Make it. And so it's about bringing in the experts who can tell us, because I'm not an expert on housing, but we know them. Bring them in and they say, you need to do this, this, and this. And it's about money, and it's about political will. And these are the people, A, B, and C, who can make that decision. And this is who has influence on those people beyond you. And you need to educate the media, and you need to get the people to show up. And I think we could map that out.
And I think we can learn some things from other nations too. Was it Finland who's dealt with the housing first issue? You know, how did they do it? I know every country has its own, you know, distinct challenges, but still there's something that we may be able to extract
there's a learning
from them.
Process where we bring in the international perspective. We look at cities that have done it well. We look at what happened to cities that didn't do it, because that's where we're going. So I think it's always very important to dangle out there where we're headed. We think it's bad now. This is, if we don't take these actions, this is where we're going. And then you mobilize the public to put their shoulder to the wheel with us and push, because what we know about the movement of the 50s and 60s, disciplined.
Yeah, very disciplined. And they had, you know, they had the benefit of what we don't have today, which is a spokesperson who was very disciplined and very insightful, had a lot of foresight. And that's kind of what helped to keep people moving, because he knew the exact thing to say at the exact moment to people. He knew how to, you know, frame it in a way that everybody could understand and grasp it, and look at all different sides and not just be one-sided. I mean, that was the gift of Dr. King that we miss so often today. But I was going to also say the assessment of all of this, just momentarily around the housing issue, because one of the things, you know, that we all know at this point in terms of, you know, our unsheltered members of our family, some of them have become accustomed to living in the state that they're living in, you know, and some of them purposely don't want to be under certain conditions that we live in. For instance, some of them like the outdoors, not all of them. They, you know, and so one of the things that I think I mentioned to you all is even considering spaces and places where there's inside and outside, that they can still have that outside space, you know, but have places where they can properly, you know, dispose of things related to their body and take care, you know, things also related to their body, and then all the other wraparound services that are necessary, essential. But we got to ask some fundamental questions. I mean, are we prepared in this nation to accept the fact that there are some people that are part of our humanity that we are going to have to take care of, whether we like it or not? We can keep ignoring it and saying, you know, brushing it off, pushing it, even when we talk about immigration, pushing people off to another city or whatever. No, I mean, there are things that we're going to have to grapple with around immigration, as difficult as it is, you know, and with the unsheltered, there are things that we're going to have to say, okay, you all, even though in the nation we believe, you know, that there's a way for people to do things, to quote unquote empower themselves, take advantage of opportunities. There's some people that never will be able to do that, no matter what we do to set them up for that, because they're too far gone.
You know, one of the things that we need to do is, and we've been thinking about this a lot at the Carter Center, because President Carter, when he was president, he signed 2 UN treaties. One was the Treaty on Civil Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. He signed both those treaties and went in the White House, committing the U.S. to look at this as interdependent rights. A right to housing, right to an adequate standard of living. And that was kind of looked at in 1977 as rather radical and very uncapitalist-like. But we've been thinking about how do you communicate that, what you just said, Dr. King, which is that housing and an adequate standard of living and human dignity, these are human rights. They are rights, just like the right to vote, just like the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. These rights are the same. They have the same equal weight. And because we don't view it that way, we think of these as privileges that you have to work for it.
Right.
You have to earn it. So if we shift the mindset, talk about shifting the mindset, a human being, think about a human being. A human being, if they have rights, then we as a society, it's not that I'm telling this builder over here, the state is going to force you to build housing no, it's that the state and the community recognizes that people have a right. And so your policies are based on that acceptance. So when you're sitting in the Georgia State Legislature and you have developers coming to you and trying to pass laws, you say, all right, builder X, you cannot pay a fine to get out of 20% affordable housing. You will not be able to work in the state if you don't provide affordable housing based on this number. Okay, DeKalb County, there are 40,000 people waiting for a Section 8 housing. You must provide 40,000 Section 8 grants, not 4,000 that you have. These are the kinds that when you have a human rights frame and you say these are human beings that have these rights, your policies will follow. And so this is a shift of mind that we have to make. And when we do, then you can get people to say, oh, it's a human being. Oh, they have mental illness, or they have they do not have the capacity to work a 9-to-5 job. They're not willing to do it, but they're still a human being. They need a place to safely sleep.
Well, and then we all need, the 3 of us and our staffs and our boards of directors needs to sleep on the sidewalk in front of City Hall. So they do it. I think you can't get around this, how much the movement relied on putting themselves out there. And I think we are comfortable And I didn't just recommend that as the director of the National Center for
I'll do it. Sign me up.
Using it as food for thought as
Yes.
to what the movement actually did.
Hmm.
Because
Put it out there.
they put it
You
out there
said they put themselves out there. They
in
did.
a way that was unignorable. And that's what I mean, became untenable. So Karen, I totally agree with you. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, mouthfuls that they are also tools. It's both and. It's work the legislative process to make sure that it can happen, just as the movement did with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But there's another piece of this that's about heart and soul.
Yes.
And it's about putting things on the line and making it very clear that unsheltered person is as much a human being as I am. He or she, and putting aside, Dr. King, the people who don't want to be part of a government program or structure, but there are plenty who need help and need a voice, and we're going to stand with them or sit with them or lay down on the sidewalk with them until you do something about it. And our friends in the media are going to cover that.
Right.
That starts to create that groundswell that you need and break through what Karen, you called before, the wall.
Let me say here. Go ahead, Dr. King. I'm sorry.
I just want to say, we have a second.
Yeah. Well, 1 minute. Go ahead.
1 minute. I was just going to say, and connect it with a strategy and a plan, because oftentimes people are raising their voices, but they don't have a solution for the folks they're making the demands from, and they're expecting the people they're making the demands from to know what to do, and sometimes they don't know what to do. So like Daddy said, we got to help them. We got to help them to know what to do.
So we're going to gather all the experts. They're going to help us lay out our demands.
Yes.
And we'll say, this is the answer.
Right.
You also have to be in compliance with international human rights standards, because we signed all these treaties. So you don't want to run afoul of that. So there's a policy piece, there's the solutions piece, and then there's what we, civil society, can do by being nonviolent. We'll do it nonviolently. We'll do it by transforming ourselves. But I think all three of those things are
Yes.
They all have to happen.
Wait, one more thing. One more thing. We need the faith. I know, but we need the faith communities. In addition,
definitely.
we need the churches, the synagogue, the mosque. Everybody needs to be.
And the students.
Yeah.
We need the students. Young people know.
Well, that's a part of the organizing our strength. I think what you all have laid out, and I want to highlight this as we wrap, is something that I'm hopeful that people who are watching in cities across the world are saying this conversation is a model for the conversation we should be having as organizations in a city. And I'm hopeful that, in closing with this, before this last conversation with Dr. King and me, that we have given an example of how we should be discussing issues. What's the foundation of it? Why do we need to talk about this? What can we do? Who needs to be educated? What's the information that needs to get out there? What part does imagery and media play? We've covered a lot. I'm actually going to go through this session and take notes and write down each of the things that we mentioned, so that we can turn it into some type of plan and ideate around it and think about it and continue to do it. And I think it's important, if you're watching this, that you do that too. And it doesn't just have to be if you're a city. If your family needs some restructuring and some justice and some love and some kindness, get with your family and say, let's talk about it. What's our foundation? What type of family do we want to be? How do we need to restructure? What do we need to unlearn as a family? Sometimes our family traditions trip us up because we say, my grandmama did that. I've learned in life, because my grandparents did it. It doesn't mean I have to live that way. That's the same thing with country, with community. Yep. So as we close this panel, wow, I just learned so much from the three of you. I've just been sitting back like, hey, this panel moderates itself. I kind of just need to interject some things every now and then.
Just wait till
these three women. These three women just need to get in a room somewhere for a retreat and talk it out. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. King. I want to, as we close this panel, just really say we're encouraging you and want you to be inspired. and well. We know this weekend is a lot because for you we're looking at a global icon and your mom as a global icon as well. But for you, your daughter, carrying the legacy of, as I told you before, not just one global leader, but two. So
yeah,
we're praying for you and sending you love and strength and encouragement, and just really are behind you in continuing the work and the legacy of your parents.
Thank you. That's right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Dr. King. And
Please
honored
get some rest.
partners. Honored.
Yes.
Honored. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to have you all as a part of doing this work, because we cannot do it in silos. We do the things we do that we're called to do as the organizations that were created to do certain things. But it really is our collective efforts that I think are going to make all the biggest differences.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Jill. Thank you, Karen. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing the work and getting, as John Lewis said, getting in good trouble together.
Yeah.
All right.
Getting into good trouble.